I worked the evening shift at a large fulfillment warehouse outside Columbus, Ohio for about 14 months. And I want to establish some context before I get into what happened, because the context changes how you understand the timeline. The evening shift ran from 4 in the afternoon until midnight, which meant I was driving home alone on industrial access roads at 12:30 or 1 in the morning, which is a detail that becomes relevant. The warehouse employed about 200 people across all shifts, and the evening crew was around 60, which was large enough that you did not know everyone, but small enough that you knew the people on your section of the floor. My section was receiving about 12 people on a given night, and I had been there long enough that I knew everyone in my section well enough to recognize their routines and their habits. The coworker I am going to describe, I will call him Nathan. Nathan joined on our section about 8 months after I did, which meant I had 6 months of knowing the section before he arrived, which meant I had a baseline for normal that his arrival changed in ways I noticed, but initially attributed to the general adjustment period of a new person finding their place in an established team. Nathan was in his late 30s, quiet in a way that on a loud warehouse floor reads as professional, and he was efficient at the work in a way that made his team leads like him immediately. He did not cause problems. He did not miss shifts. He did not have the specific friction with coworkers that some people brought to the floor. For the first 2 months, I found nothing to notice about him beyond the general impression that he was a capable and unremarkable addition to the section. The first thing I noticed was in the 3rd month. I was on break in the employee break room, which was a large shared space with tables and vending machines and a row of lockers for the personal items people brought to work. I was at a table with my phone when I became aware that Nathan was at the locker section facing the row with his phone held at an angle that I registered without immediately processing. It was the specific angle of someone taking photographs. I looked more directly and he had moved before I could confirm what I had seen, and I put it in the category of something I had probably misread. The second thing was in the 4th month. Our section had a practice of walking out to the parking lot together after the shift ended, which was not a formal policy, but was a habit that had developed organically among the people who had been there longest. The specific mutual consideration of people leaving an industrial facility at midnight who had internalized the basic safety logic of not walking alone to their cars in a dark lot at that hour. I had participated in this without thinking about it much. What I noticed in the 4th month was that Nathan had begun positioning himself in this group walk so that he was consistently close to me. Not obviously, not in a way I could have described specifically in the moment, but in a pattern that became clear when I thought about it afterward. He was always in a position from which he could see which car was mine. I want to be specific about how I processed this because I think it represents the specific difficulty of evaluating this kind of situation. None of what I had observed was something I could have described to anyone as a clear problem. A person taking photos in a break room. A person walking near me to the parking lot. Both of these things had innocent explanations that were more available than the non-innocent explanation, and I was aware that applying a non-innocent explanation to a coworker based on those observations would make me the problem in the professional environment, not him. So I continued processing and I continued watching. The 3rd thing happened in the 5th month, and it is the one that moved Nathan from the category of something I was watching into the category of something I was concerned about. I was getting off the shift at midnight, and I had said goodnight to the people on the section, and I had walked out to the parking lot and gotten into my car and driven toward the facility exit on the access road that connected the warehouse complex to the main road. The access road was about half a mile long, straight, poorly lit, and at midnight on a weeknight was usually empty of all traffic except the shift change vehicles leaving the facility. I was about a quarter mile down the access road when I registered headlights behind me. I registered them because they were close, not dangerously close, but closer than the access road's distance from the warehouse would explain if the vehicle behind me had left the parking lot at the same time I had. A vehicle leaving at the same time from the same general parking area would have been further back. The vehicle behind me had either been waiting at the facility exit or had been parked closer to the exit than the general lot, or had accelerated to close the distance on the access road. None of those things were impossible. All of them were specific, and I noted them. I reached the main road and turned left toward the highway. The vehicle behind me turned left. I drove the 2 miles to the highway on-ramp and took it north. The vehicle took it north. I drove for approximately 4 miles on the highway and then took an exit that was not my usual exit, an exit I had no practical reason to take to see what happened. The vehicle took the exit. I drove through the surface streets near that exit for about 3 minutes, making turns that had no logical destination. The vehicle followed every turn. At the third turn, I found a gas station on the corner that was open and fully lit, and I pulled into it and parked under the canopy lighting and got out of my car and went inside and stood at the counter and watched through the window. A dark sedan drove slowly past the gas station and continued down the road and did not stop. I stayed at the gas station for 20 minutes and then drove home on a route I had not used before. I did not see the dark sedan again that night. The following week, I paid attention to the parking lot in a way I had not before, and on the third night, I identified the dark sedan in the lot. It was parked in a section of a lot I did not use, near the facility exit rather than in the general lot area, which was where a vehicle would be parked if the person using it was planning to leave the lot just after someone else. I looked up the plate through a connection I had, which I am not going to detail further, and the registration came back to Nathan. His full legal name, his home address, and the dark sedan. The car that had followed me home belonged to Nathan. I went to my shift supervisor the following evening before the shift started. I described what I had observed, the parking location, the following pattern on the access road, and the highway, the car I had identified as belonging to Nathan. My supervisor listened and said he would escalate it to the facility's HR department and their security team, and that I should document everything I had observed with dates and times. I did this. I submitted a written account the following day. The HR process took 9 days, during which I drove home on different routes each night and used different parking positions in the lot, and did not walk out with the section group because Nathan was part of that group and I did not want to be near him. I did not know what the HR process was producing or what was being said to Nathan in whatever conversations the facility was having with him. I was not told anything about the process while it was underway, which was the standard policy. On the 9th day, I was called into the HR office before my shift. The HR manager and the facility security director were both in the room, which told me before anyone spoke that what had happened was serious enough to require 2 people to deliver. The HR manager told me that the investigation had confirmed the incident I described and that Nathan had been suspended pending further review. She also told me something that she prefaced with the specific language of something she was not required to tell me, but that she felt I should know. Nathan had been a previous employee at a distribution facility in Indiana. He had left that facility following a similar complaint from a female coworker. The complaint from Indiana had been settled internally and had not produced a formal record that appeared in a standard background check. The Columbus facility had not known about it. The HR manager said this in the specific, careful language of someone acknowledging an institutional failure without being able to fully characterize it as such, and I sat with it for a moment before I said anything. I gave my 2-week notice at the end of that meeting. Not because I felt unsafe in the facility after Nathan's suspension, but because the 9 days of not knowing what was happening while continuing to work in the same building as the person who had followed me home had produced a specific effect that I did not think would resolve with Nathan's absence. I finished my notice and I left, and I collected my final paycheck, and I do not work evenings anymore. I worked as a night shift supervisor at a hospital laundry facility in Indianapolis for about 2 years. And I want to describe the environment before I describe what happened, because the environment is what made everything possible and what made it difficult to see clearly until it was already serious. Hospital laundry facilities operate around the clock because hospitals operate around the clock, which means the night shift handles the bulk of the processing that the day shift generates. The night crew is usually small, and the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning have a specific quality of isolation that you only fully understand if you have worked them. I was one of 3 supervisors on the night rotation, and my shift ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. I will call the coworker I need to describe as Dennis. He was in his mid-40s, had been at the facility for about 7 years when I started, which made him one of the longer-serving members among the night crew, and he had the specific confidence of someone who had been doing a job long enough to feel ownership of it. He was not a supervisor. He was a line worker in the processing section, but 7 years in a facility where turnover was significant had given him a standing that was informal and real. He knew the equipments, the protocols. He knew which procedures had workarounds that the official documentation did not acknowledge. The shift leads liked him because he made their work easier. I registered this about him during my first month, and I continued registering it throughout the time that followed. Because understanding Dennis's position in the facility's social structure is essential for understanding why what he did was possible for as long as it was. Dennis paid me a specific kind of attention from the beginning that I want to describe as precisely as I can because precision matters here. It was not aggressive. It was not overtly inappropriate. It was consistent in a way that I initially attributed to his general interest in anyone new to the night crew, a quality that long-term shift workers sometimes developed, a proprietary interest in newcomers navigating an environment they felt they understood better than anyone. He asked me questions about myself during the slower periods of the shift with a regularity that I noticed. Not just the getting to know you questions of early workplace interaction, but a sustained interest that continued past the point where most workplace social calibration produced a settled mutual understanding and left it there. Dennis kept gathering information about me past that point. I addressed it in the professional way available to me, which was to become less forthcoming. I shortened my answers. I redirected conversations. I maintained the professional cordiality that the supervisory role required without adding personal information to it. This is the standard approach, and it usually produces the standard result, which is that the other person calibrates to the new level of engagement and the dynamic settles. With Dennis, it did not produce that result. He continued asking questions, and he began substituting observation for the information I was no longer providing directly. What I mean by observation is this. I began noticing that Dennis knew things about my routine that I had not told him. He knew which break room I used and at what time. He knew which exit I used when I left the facility after the shift. He knew that I drove a specific vehicle and where I parked it in the facility lot. He knew when I was scheduled for overtime and when I was not. None of these things were secret. All of them were observable to someone paying sustained attention to my patterns over a period of weeks, and that is exactly what I concluded Dennis had been doing. Observing my patterns with the specific, sustained attention of someone building a picture of my routine. I want to be honest that I went back and forth on this conclusion for a long time before I committed to it, because the alternative conclusion was that I was misreading ordinary workplace familiarity as something it was not, and the consequences of misreading in that direction in a professional environment were significant. I did not want to make an accusation against a 7-year employee based on the observation that he knew what break room I used. The event that ended my uncertainty happened on a Thursday night in the 7th month. I had worked my shift, and at 6 in the morning I had left through my usual exit and walked to my car in my usual section of the parking lot. I had driven to the coffee shop I went to most mornings after the shift, a place about a mile from the facility on the route toward my apartment. I ordered my usual and sat at a table near the window with my phone while I waited. Dennis came in 4 minutes after I did. Not from the facility direction. He came in from the street as though he had been on the street outside, and he ordered at the counter, and he came to a table near mine, and he sat down. He said good morning as though this were entirely natural, as though we had a pattern of being at this coffee shop together that I had simply not registered, and his manner had the specific quality of someone performing casualness rather than experiencing it. I said good morning, and I drank my coffee and I left. I drove to my apartment on a route I varied that morning because I was thinking about the fact that Dennis had been at my coffee shop 4 minutes after I arrived, and I did not know whether he had followed me there or whether he had been waiting somewhere on the route and had seen me pass and had preceded me there. Both possibilities required knowledge of my post-shift pattern that I had not given him and that the facility itself would not have generated. I went to my direct supervisor that evening before my shift. I described the pattern I had observed over the 7 months, the specific knowledge Dennis had demonstrated of my routine, and the coffee shop incident. My supervisor listened with an attention that told me before he spoke that this was not entirely new information to him. He said he would raise it with the facility manager and the HR department, and that I should document everything I had observed with dates and specific examples. He said it in the specific, practiced way of someone who had been in a situation like this before, which was itself a piece of information. I documented, and I submitted, and I waited. During the 9 days of the HR process, I changed my routine completely. I used different exits at the end of the shift. I parked in different sections of the lot. I changed my post-shift route and did not go to the coffee shop at all. I did not see Dennis in any of the non-facility locations where his presence would have been unexplainable. Whatever surveillance pattern he had established, the disruption of my routine disrupted it. On the 9th day, my supervisor called me into his office before the shift. The facility manager was also there, which told me the outcome was significant. The facility manager told me that the investigation had confirmed what I had described, that Dennis had been terminated effective immediately, and that the termination was for cause and would be documented as such. Then he said something that he prefaced with the statement that he believed I had a right to know it. The facility had 2 instances on record from Dennis's 7-year employment of similar complaints from female workers. The first had been resolved informally in his 2nd year. The second had produced a formal warning in his 4th year. Both were in his file. Both had been considered in the current investigation. The facility manager said that the prior instances had been handled in ways that in retrospect had not adequately protected current employees from a pattern of behavior that the documentation now made clear was not isolated. I heard this information and I thanked him, and I went and worked my shift, and at the end of it, I typed my resignation on my phone in the parking lot before I started my car. I gave 2 weeks' notice, and I worked them, and I left. And on the last night, I drove home on a route I had not used before, and I did not go to the coffee shop. I was a 2nd-year law associate at a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I want to be specific about what that means in terms of working conditions because it is directly relevant to what happened. 2nd-year associates at firms like mine worked late. Not occasionally late. Not once in a while late. Consistently, structurally, fundamentally late, in the way that the billing model of large law firms produces late nights as a routine feature of the work rather than an exceptional one. I was regularly at the office until 9 or 10 at night, sometimes later, and the specific social geography of late nights in a law firm is different from the daytime hours. The support staff goes home. Most of the senior attorneys also leaves. The associates who are building their hours stay, and the ones who stay late together develop the specific closeness of people who share an experience that others do not see. The coworker I am describing, I will call him Martin. He was a 3rd-year associate when I was a 2nd year, which meant he had been at the firm a year longer than me and had the specific navigational confidence of someone who had learned the environment and was comfortable in it. He was good at his work. He was well regarded by the partners on his practice group. He had the specific social fluency of someone who was good at being liked. Martin began paying attention to me in the 3rd month, not dramatically. He started appearing in the kitchen on our floor when I was getting coffee in the evenings, which was explainable by the kitchen being a shared space. He started stopping by my office during the late hours with questions about cases that were within his competence to answer independently, questions that functioned as reasons to be in my doorway more than as genuine requests for input. He remembered things I had said in passing with a specificity that I noticed and attributed to his general social attentiveness. He was, in the language available to me at the time, friendly in a way that was more than professionally necessary without crossing any line I could clearly identify. By the 5th month, Martin's presence in my late evenings at the office had become consistent enough that I was aware of planning around it, taking different routes to the kitchen, timing my movements to the printer differently, small adjustments that I was making without fully acknowledging to myself why I was making them. I had not consciously concluded that his behavior was a problem. I had simply begun responding to it physically before I had processed it intellectually. The first specific event happened on a Wednesday evening in the 6th month. I was working late, later than usual, and by 10:30 I was one of 3 people left on our floor. Martin was one of the other 2. At approximately 10:45, I went to the printer at the far end of the floor to collect a document, and when I returned to my office, Martin was inside it. Not standing at the door. Inside it. Sitting in the client chair across from my desk, which would be a normal position for someone waiting to speak to me, except that I had not invited him in and had not been aware of his intention to enter my office. He said he had a question about a motion filing deadline, and he held up a document as evidence of the question's legitimacy. I answered the question from the doorway without going back to my desk, standing in a way that made the conversation brief and the expectation of his departure clear. He left. He said goodnight in a pleasant tone. I sat down at my desk after he was gone, and I looked at my desk surface, which was in its standard state of organized working papers, and I did not know whether anything had been touched. The document arrangement looked the same. My phone was where I had left it. My notebook was where I had left it. I could not identify any disturbance. But I had not identified the possibility of a disturbance until I was already back at my desk looking for one, which meant the window for observing whether anything had been moved or accessed was already passed. I began locking my office when I left it, which required checking out a key from building management because associate offices in our firm did not typically have individual locks engaged. The building manager found this unusual enough to ask about, and I told her I was working on sensitive client materials that required additional security, which was true in a general sense and was not the specific truth. She gave me the key without further question. The second specific event happened 3 weeks later. I had worked late on a Friday, later than I had intended, and I had left the building at 11:15 and walked to the parking garage 2 blocks from the firm where most of the associates parked. My car was on the 3rd level, and I took the elevator and walked to it in the specific, tired, purposeful way of someone who has been inside too long and wants to be in motion. I got in and started the engine and reached for my bag on the passenger seat to find my phone, and the bag was not in the position I had left it. I want to be precise. The bag was on the passenger seat, which was where I always put it when I drove. But it was positioned differently from how I placed it. I always put it with the strap facing the center console. The bag was facing the window. It was a specific enough difference that it registered immediately. I sat in the running car on the 3rd level of the parking garage at 11:15 on a Friday night, and I looked at my bag and I did not pick it up immediately. I sat there and I thought about when the bag had last been out of my sight. I had taken it from my office to the restroom at approximately 9. I had brought it back to the office. It had been on the floor beside my desk until I left, at which point I had picked it up and carried it to the elevator and through the lobby and the 2 blocks to the garage. I had not put it down anywhere between my office and my car, which meant if the bag had been accessed, it had been accessed in my office before I picked it up at the end of the night, during the period when I had been away from my desk. I checked the bag's contents. My wallet, my phone, my building access card, all present, nothing missing. The bag had been moved and replaced, was my conclusion, and I held that conclusion while I drove home and held it through the weekend. On Monday morning, I requested a meeting with the firm's managing partner, whom I had met twice and who is not someone junior associates typically requested meetings with directly. The request was unusual enough to produce the meeting by that afternoon, which told me the managing partner had understood from the request itself that something significant was being raised. I described everything in the managing partner's office: the consistent late evening appearances, the office entry, the bag's repositioning. I described the timeline and the pattern with the same precision I applied to legal writing because that was the tool available to me and because precision was what the situation required. The managing partner listened without interrupting, which was itself a form of information because experienced attorneys interrupt when they are processing something ordinary and go quiet when they are processing something that requires careful handling. When I finished, She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me to confirm the name. I confirmed it. She asked me if I'd told anyone else. I said no. She said she appreciated me bringing this to her directly and that the firm would handle it with the seriousness it required. Then she said, in the specific careful language of someone disclosing something they have weighed the decision to disclose, that Martin had been the subject of a complaint at his previous firm prior to joining ours, and that the nature of that complaint was consistent with what I had described. She said the reference check process had not surfaced it because it had been handled internally at the previous firm in a way that did not produce a formal record. I left the managing partner's office and I went back to my desk and I wrote my resignation letter on my personal laptop rather than the firm's system. I gave 4 weeks' notice because I was professional about it, and during those 4 weeks Martin was not present in the office because his employment had been terminated the day after my meeting with the managing partner. I finished my notice period and I collected my personal items and I rode the elevator down from our floor for the last time and I walked out of the building and I did not go back.